Welcome to Thursdays at 4 at the Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Jennifer Gunn, and for those of you who are not on the IAS listserv and would like to be, there's a sign-up sheet on the table over there. I'm already borrowing from our speaker today because when I said our first slide was going to be Prince, for those of you who haven't heard the news, he died today, and she said Minnesota's greatest cultural export. So with affection for Prince. All right, so tomorrow's Earth Day for those of you who don't know, and I wanted to announce a change in the Thursdays at 4 program for May 5th. Originally we were supposed to have Peter Timmer, but he can't make it. So instead we're going to have a homegrown program. I wanted to call it what I did with my semester vacation. I was voted down. Instead it's a look at the fellowship IAS current IAS residential fellows, a handful of them will be talking about their current research. For those of you who don't know about this, for the second year, the IAS will be offering scholars and artists in residence. We have one over on the side right now, Rachel. And this is unfortunately, you see in big letters, residential opportunity without stipend for faculty, staff who are on leave. We don't have, and community artists and scholars, unfortunately we don't have a budget to pay you, but we would welcome you to apply for a fellowship and be part of our fellowship community for one semester. Those applications are due on May 9th, and you can find them in the drop-down bar under applications on the IAS website. So next week, our Thursdays at 4 speaker will be Paul Cobb from the University of Pennsylvania, and he'll be talking about Getting Crusaded, History and the Targets of Medieval Holy War. Which brings us to today's program. We're very fortunate today that our speaker is part of the University of Minnesota International African Studies Conference. The title of the conference is Fault Lines, Rethinking Temporal and Disciplinary Traditions in African Studies. And the conference is going on today through Saturday. It's hosted by the African History Graduate Student Collaborative and co-sponsored by many, many units on campus. And I will let you read most of them here, but particularly the Consortium for the Study of the Pre-Modern World, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study, sorry, I always get acronyms mixed up, ICGC. I'm just going to say ICGC. IGS, a number of the Institute for Global Studies, a number of departments, and of course the IAS. So we're very happy to have this conference on campus, and we're also very happy to have Jane Taylor with us as a result of having this conference on campus. And to introduce Jane Taylor, I'm going to turn us over to Margaret Wary, who is an associate professor in the Department of Theater, Arts, and Dance.
It is, of course, a tremendous honor to introduce Professor Jane Taylor. So thank you, Virgil, and your colleagues for inviting me to do so, and thank you, of course, for bringing her to this university. Like many in my own discipline of theater studies, I first came to know Professor Taylor's work through her magnificent play, Ubu and the Truth Commission, which she wrote in collaboration with a handspring puppet company and the artist William Cambridge. I was struck not only by the acuity and daring of Taylor's language, but by its remarkable relationship with the puppets and animations, which, with their peculiar liminality, perfectly embodied the problems of justice, truth, and the unstable membrane between the past and present, the living and the dead, with which Taylor was concerned. In a way that I still find provocative, haunting, uncomfortable, poignant, and utterly unforgettable, even after having taught the play countless times. This play materialized thought. Ubu and the Truth Commission exemplifies what I've come to recognize as the hallmark of Professor Taylor's work as a whole. It thinks with art, publicly and consequentially, and often collaboratively. It uses aesthetics to think philosophy, to think politics, to think history. Professor Taylor works like few others at the intersection of aesthetic practice and intellectual inquiry. As such, her output defies disciplinary boundaries. It spans theatrical practice, literature, history, medical humanities, cultural criticism, and performance theory. She is obviously a scholar with important works of art and cultural criticism, history and performance theory, including a study of the Handspring Puppet Company and, I understand, under development, a performance history of sincerity. But she is also an award-winning novelist. Her recent work includes the Transplant Men, and this is an insert from Jennifer Gunn, who wanted me to put on her medical historian hat, and note that this is a work about the first human heart transplant that took place in South Africa in the 1960s, but had its roots, apparently, here at the University of Minnesota, where Christian Barnard did a 2-year fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery. Interesting. So yes, she's not only a playwright, not only a novelist, she's a playwright. She's also a curator whose prominent exhibitions, such as Fault Lines, about the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, have catalyzed important debates. Her rich and wide-ranging collaborations with other artists and scholars, and here I might note her collaboration with medievalist David Nierenberg for Documenta, or her commission by Stephen Greenblatt of After Cardenio. These collaborations are a marker of both the reach, the generosity, and the generativity of her intellect. And of course, she also teaches. Professor Taylor is the Wole Soyinka Chair of Drama and Theatre Studies at the University of Leeds and has held chairships and fellowships at the University of Witwatersrand, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Berkeley, Oxford, and Cambridge. So without further ado, I give you novelist, curator, playwright, scholar, public intellectual, Professor Jane Taylor.
Generosity of that, and also for applying your mind to thinking about the puppet and the curious relation between pure idea and the richness of matter, and how those things inflict and complicate one another. And so in a way, it's out of my engagement with Handspring Puppet Company that this piece arises, and this is the piece that was commissioned by Stephen Greenblatt. So those conversations come together in a curious way. I do want very much to thank the Institute for Advanced Study for the opportunity to be here, and the Consortium for the Study of the Early Modern World. So those are really very strong conversations that I'll be having here, although my hat here is facilitated by the opportunity to be part of the African Studies Graduate Conference today. And the persons engaged there know how richly I appreciate and value the opportunity to be here working and playing in the same space with you. So let me launch then into a conversation with you. I'm going to be exploring the ways in which the making of a recent theatrical production, After Cardenio, precipitated me into a substantial research initiative about early modern practice, natural philosophy, and the history of science. So what I want you to really understand is the way that there's a kind of a circulation between the research imperative and the creative obligation, and how those things keep on wrestling with one another and displacing each other. So I'm going to begin then with the scene that impelled both my play and the subsequent research that arose out of it. In 1650, a young woman, Anne Green, was hanged for infanticide in Oxford. Some of you may know of the case. Her body was handed over to members of the university's medical community for the purposes of an anatomy. This was an opportunity of considerable intellectual and spiritual interest, though not wholly unusual. In particular kinds of death, that of the executed criminal, for example, the corpse could be dissected and examined internally, as part of a vast, diffuse exploration into the workings of the human being. In 1636, the Great Charter of Charles I granted the Oxford anatomy reader the right to demand, for the purposes of anatomical dissection, the body of any person executed within 21 miles of Oxford. Previously, the cadavers were required to be from the city itself. This injunction of a range of 21 miles demonstrates a logic that is strikingly different to that which seemed to pertain in Bologna some 200 years earlier, where the statute on dissection stipulated that the body must come from at least 30 miles outside of Bologna. There are certainly too many variables, medical, cosmological, theological, and legal, at play in a 200-year difference between a European and an English university context for one to speculate on the meaning of such distinctions. However, the rulings do assert one absolute truth, that neither legislation about proximity or distance was natural or given. Both practices, the exogamous garnering of corpses or the endogamous, are surely culturally specific and defined. Remarkably, the woman revived on the anatomy table just as the doctors were due to begin dissecting the body. These images are from the recent work of theatre that I wrote and staged on a commission from Renaissance scholar Stephen Greenblatt. The paper explores several strands at once: the premise behind the commission from Greenblatt, the arts of staging ideas, and the historical understanding of the anatomy lesson, with an eye to the link between the theatre and the anatomy theatre. I'm interested too in what the episode tells us about the history of the Royal Society, as well as the medical and philosophical shifts that arise from the episode in 1650. The theatrical commission from Greenblatt provided the trigger for what has become an ongoing inquiry for me. I was one of a dozen playwrights approached by him to make a version of a so-called missing Shakespeare play, pleasingly the only female in the group. Well, not necessarily pleasingly, but striking. A work titled Cardenio that has come down through the tradition as by Shakespeare, although no copy of the original play text has ever come to light. Greenblatt's ambition was surely to consolidate the full extent of the Shakespeare oeuvre and to identify any works that might make a claim to belong inside rather than outside the canon. He began to explore literary fragments and ambiguous works, plays of dubious attribution or written as collaborations, and thus at the edge of the writings that could be fixed and authenticated as Shakespeare's. The question that he was addressing via the theatrical and scholarly communities was, what was the likelihood that Shakespeare would have written a Cardenio? If so, what might be the concerns, theatrical opportunities he might have opened up by such an endeavour? All that was known was the title. What freight did that title carry? There's some skepticism about the claims about the play's position inside the canon. The entrepreneurial bookseller Humphrey Moseley in 1653 registered his edition of Shakespeare's plays from 1647, and he identified the work as a play by Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Shakespeare, though that may well have been a bit of promotional manipulation. Yet it does seem clear that a play titled Cardenio was performed by the King's men between 1611 and 1612, though without attribution. The strongest clue to the play's possible plot arises from the fact that the title refers to a character, Cardenio, the name given to a melancholy hero from Cervantes' celebrated novel Don Quixote. In the novel, Cardenio has lost his mind and lives disguised in the mountains because he believes that his beloved has been seduced by the local overlord. When I had received the commission to write a Cardenio, my instinctive response was that I couldn't make a pastiche of a Shakespeare play. And yet, nor could I avoid wanting to engage with the force of his imagination. What began to interest me was the question of how or why Shakespeare might have written in response to Cervantes. What in the vast, various novel Don Quixote, full of chivalric idealism, wild buffoonery, and irony, could be reconciled with Shakespeare's psychological portraiture, his wordplay, his scrutiny of statecraft and power? What would the history of the book and the stage tell us about one another? And how does 17th century Spanish Catholicism inform us about emergent Protestantism? The two great writers were linked by more than chance, it seems. Both men are recorded as having died on the same date, though not on the same day. Spain and England were on different calendars in 1613. By popular accounts, Cervantes died on 23rd April, some 10 days before Shakespeare died on the same date, 10 days later. Though it would be well advised to embrace these dates with some skepticism. I began to undertake research, looking for ways into the project. Greenblatt and his friend Charles Mee had written a first experiment, a light-hearted comedy based on the motif of the sexual wager. One man challenges his friend to test the virtue of his wife. My response on reading that play was that, writing from South Africa in the 21st century, it was very difficult to imagine sexual infidelity as quite the same reckless riot as they were imagining. The context of AIDS, sexual violence, and infant mortality cast a particular kind of pall over the sport so imagined. I was interested in the tough questions around the droit de seigneur, power, sexual domination, and betrayal. In Cervantes' novel, Cardenio's love, Lucinda, escapes the enforced marriage being urged upon her by fainting at the altar, and so it occurred to me that there may well be a pregnancy hidden inside the plot that I was devising. I began to undertake research into early modern sexuality and the law, and considered how these circumstances might provide a dramatic situation concordant with Shakespeare's perennial investigations in the late plays. My first imaginative journey was to consider the project in terms of social and literary history. This task is in a complex relation to the work of creative and performance interpretation, seeking to place my piece on a continuum with research integrity at one end and creative play at the other. So, as a beginning, I turned to early English books online. Luck has something to do with it, and so does art history, because the text that attracted me was illustrated. As anyone dealing with manuscript knows, the visual image is a rarity in the published texts of the early modern period, and so has a kind of exorbitant glamour that catches one's attention as it startles one from out of the screeds of sameness. The text that caught my eye had a thrilling yet macabre woodcut. That was how I came upon the broadsheet recounting the story of Anne Green, who in 1650 was hanged for infanticide. Anne is not just a melancholy fact of history. Rather, she becomes a cause célèbre, because when her hanged body was handed over to the University for the anatomy, she regained consciousness on the anatomy table. There are at least 3 distinct broadsheet versions of Anne Green's history, and so shocking were these events that over 20 poems were written by Oxford Fellows about her, one of whom is Christopher Wren. The story is also recounted by Anthony Wood, the Oxford diarist, who in fact is one of the poets who writes one of those verses I described above. The story is also narrated in Robert Plott's The Natural History of Oxfordshire, and in James Heath's Chronicle of the Late Intestine War. As Anne Green gathered herself to speak, her first words were allegedly, "Behold God's providence." Her survival was testimony to her innocence, became her assertion. It was not, she claimed, an abortion or infanticide, but an accidental miscarriage. What the broadsheet hints at is a bitter saga involving a young working girl who was impregnated by the youthful Geoffrey Reed while she was in the service of his grandfather, Sir Thomas. Her unhappy situation was disclosed when a fellow servant heard moans coming from the privy and went to investigate, and found the servant and the little corpse. The sometime friend immediately ran shrieking to the master and mistress of the house, disclosing Anne's misery and her alleged crime. So I'm just going to talk to you for 1 second about what we're looking at here that's of particular kind of graphic interest. What we're seeing here is the distillation of a sequence of event into a single moment. So this is actually a kind of, it has a historical narrative inside of it. Anne Green, being from the working classes, the members of her family belonged to the sheriff's guard. So she was actually effectively executed by members of her family, her cousins. So she asked them when they hanged her, please to beat on her chest with muskets and to pull on her legs to make her execution sure and swift. So what you see here in these scenes, these images, is the cousins pulling on her feet and bludgeoning her to death. There has been some subsequent medical interpretation of the small traces that we have of the description of her coming toward herself and so on, and what she remembered and so on after the very, very small traces. And there is some speculation that the thumping on her chest might have quick-started her heart, that it might actually have been generative of a kind of reawakening in her. Because the anatomies always happened in the dead of winter, because there was no refrigeration and you want to keep the body intact as long as possible in order to be able to conduct the anatomy across time, the anatomies would happen in the December-January period, so it was freezing cold. And so Thomas Willis, one of the anatomists who helped resurrect her, immediately ordered one of his serving women to get into bed with her. So what you see here is not the sexual conjunction that led to the dastardly event, but is actually someone bringing life, blood, and warmth back into Anne Green. Presumably in defense of family and property, the old man was a vociferous advocate that Anne be hanged again after her failed reckoning with the rope. It's the recorded irony that Sir Thomas Reed died 3 days after Anne was acquitted, presumably from something like an apoplexy at being so crossed. Richard Watkins, one of the observers, indicates that Sir Thomas's sudden death was among several mitigating factors in favour of Anne. It was held by some as evidence of her innocence. Recent research has produced a complex picture of the legal entanglements arising from the death of an infant. The official will increasingly sought to curb the murdering of newborns. Nonetheless, the law is hard-pressed to prove intention in these cases. In some instances, where a mother was able to show several elements of provision for the infant, such as small garments or a cot blanket, this was deemed evidence of her aspiration that the babe be nurtured. The status and meaning of the infant is obviously shifting in the 17th century, and new constraints and controls are instituted. In 1624, Parliament passed an act to, quote, prevent the murdering of bastard children. William Walsh, by the end of the century, asserts in a dialogue concerning women, quote, go but one circuit with the judges here in England, observe how many women are condemned for killing their bastard children. I have for several years also taught Defoe's Roxana. I don't know if any of you here have read it. I recommend it very highly. Written several decades later, in that novel, Roxana allows herself to misinterpret an offer by her serving woman to dispose of Roxana's illegitimate child, who remarkably had survived into adulthood through mischance. The serving woman's name, tellingly, is Amy, either friend or me, a second self. So Amy, believing now that she acts on instruction, murders Roxana's daughter, an action that leaves the narrator bewildered yet complicit. It's a ghastly ending. Defoe had been a campaigner for children's rights, it seems, and several of his novels worry about the abandoned infant. This question, of course, crosses over with matters of rights to life and abortion, as it often does. The woman is implicitly set at legal odds with the child. Defoe's paper, Conjugal Lewdness, from 1727 rails against abortion within marriage, though recent research does suggest that it probably was used within marriage more than had been previously imagined, and certainly it was used extensively outside of marriage. The law intervened awkwardly and unevenly in such matters, and so it signalled its purposes through a decree that any birth kept secret could be inferred to signal danger. And the failure to disclose was itself criminal. The stories are grim and the circumstances hard to imagine. And I quote, "Jane Lockwood confessed that she bore a stillborn child alone and that she left it on her bed, intending to bury it, but that her father's dogs pulled it off. She was much to blame," she admitted. She did not acquaint her mother and neighbours therewith. Jane Hardy, a widow, confessed that she had given birth to twins, both dead, and kept them by her about a week's space before she had laid them in the earth of her floor. These were just some of the ideas percolating in the back of my mind as I began to imagine a viable play. But what was foremost was a visual event, that opening scene with a girl on an anatomy table about to be dissected who comes back to life. At the disclosure of the situation, as Anne was incarcerated, tried, and found guilty of murdering her infant. But there were a sequence of interventions, including the evidence with the death of Sir Thomas Reed, and that decision was overturned, and Anne was deemed to have been the mother of an accidental miscarriage. Her story was reminiscent for me of the late Shakespeare plays, with his haunting explorations of the possibility of renewal, resurrection, rebirth. Of course, the puzzle of a return from death is there even in the early plays. Juliet's feigned death is followed by her regained consciousness, though tragically too late for Romeo, who kills himself in grief. However, there is a quality of self-delusional hope in the face of despair that characterizes several of the mature plays. And here I have in mind the enigmatic structure of The Winter's Tale, in which Leontes accuses his wife, Hermione, of infidelity and banishes her, only to learn of Hermione's blamelessness after her death. Years pass, and the melancholy king has a statue made in commemoration of his wronged wife. The play concludes, implausibly, with Hermione's statue coming to life, and hope is restored. A comparable logic is implicit in the ending of King Lear. The old king, distraught and deluded at the end of the play, has his loving daughter Cordelia cut down from where she has been hanged. She is laid at the feet of Lear, who deceives himself that she still lives and breathes. At this point of wretchedness, he dies from shock and heartbreak, and so never has to come to terms with the fact that his daughter is irrecoverably dead, and that he was the cause of her death. Anne Green's story is substantially different, but it does allow for the apparently miraculous transformation from death to life of a hanged girl. When I came across the broadsheet giving an account of the miracle, I was attracted by what seemed to me that irresistible event. As I began to consider the theoretical and philosophical potential of this profoundly visual episode, it seemed to me that the incident could figure, in the sense of embody, many of the major inquiries of the 17th century. Where did identity locate itself? In the body or in some indefinable non-material essence? 1650, the year of Anne Green's death, was coincidentally the year in which Descartes died. His philosophy of the dual character of human identity as both matter and soul has defined subsequent Western metaphysics. This thus becomes a question of practical staging, how to embody these ideas. At the same time, the episode provides an emblem of the great 17th century intersection of story and science. The images we've seen from the play take as a kind of implicit point of origin Rembrandt's very influential painting of the Anatomy Theatre of Dr. Tulp, a work that alludes to an anatomy undertaken in 1632. And for those of you who were in the seminar yesterday, I do apologize. I'm going to repeat just a fragment of this because I think it's necessary for the larger conversation, but there are one or two new elements to think about. So this is the Dr. Tulp anatomy lesson, and what we discussed very extensively in the seminar yesterday is we see Dr. Tulp, who was the most celebrated anatomist in the Netherlands at the time, talking to a community of basically the civic aristocracy, if one could have had such a thing in Netherlandish culture, about an anatomy that he's undertaking. And what I'm particularly interested in is, there are two things. The first is that kind of dispersed field of gazes, with everybody looking in a kind of fairly fixated way into a completely different plane. And it seems to me that some of these figures, the figure in the kind of pinkish suit, is gazing into the body itself and learning from the body. The figure to his left is actually looking at Tulp's fingers. The figure to his right, I suspect, is actually looking into the pages of this vast book, which it would have been, I'm speculating, would have been Vesalius's Anatomy. So there's that line of sight. But the two figures that are particularly intriguing to me are Dr. Tulp and the man at the back. Because Dr. Tulp seems to me to be thinking about how thought becomes articulated in flesh. Because he is making that gesture, the exemplary gesture of the opposable thumb and first digit of the hand, that which allows us to grasp, that which effectively in the philosophical tradition makes us human. And he is at the same time pulling on a tendon in the man's arm. Now you'll see here in the detail, that man's finger is flexed. His little finger, can you see? It's pulled up in an arc. So the pulling on the tendon is making that gesture happen. And so at the same time, Tulp is thinking about the movement of the thumb and the finger as an idea. And I suspect what is being contained in this proposition is an exploration of how the idea to move that finger would pass through the tendon into the actual articulation of the limb. And the figure at the back, who seems to be sort of looking into a kind of an abstraction, he's not looking at the scene, he's looking at an idea. His finger, his index finger, is slightly arched also. So he is actually flexing his finger and thinking about what it is that Dr. Tulp is demonstrating there. So I think the scene is actually a scene about mind and matter. And what I particularly like also is that it has been speculated that Descartes may well have been at this anatomy, because the anatomies were great, celebrated public events, and he was in Amsterdam at the time, and he describes in his letters from the period going to the abattoirs and the butchers to go and look at. He was at that stage trying to find out where mind and matter might intersect inside the body. So in all likelihood, Descartes himself was there. So Descartes is in the back of my mind, 1650, the year in which Anne Green dies. The play was performed in what was once the Anatomy Theatre at the University of Cape Town. So we actually reconstructed this old Anatomy Theatre into a playhouse, and it would have been the Anatomy Theatre where Chris Barnard, the heart transplant surgeon, would have himself observed anatomies. So the venue itself has a particular kind of residue of meaning. An anatomy theatre is a particularly nice thing for any of you who ever are going to be making puppet plays or thinking about the puppet, because it's so precipitously steep that everybody is very close to the event. So it means that the observational proximity to any minor movement, any kind of micro movement that the puppet might be doing, everybody is fairly close to, so it's a very good kind of space for that sort of work. And I had at that stage started thinking about deploying the puppet as my primary medium for thinking about the mind-body conjunction. So this is an image of Vesalius, the famous anatomist, upon whom Tulp would have modelled himself. And here he is too, again exploring the complexity of the hand. The hand is a very powerful idea in the early modern imagining of human consciousness. Okay, sorry, that's just an unnecessary doubling. Okay. The first scene begins with a purely oral event in the dark with a reverie on time. Shakespeare's Winter's Tale is divided into two halves by a comment on time. It's a kind of an oral prologue. While that prologue was being spoken, we saw a filmed image of two breasts in a pool of blood. They're rather elusive as an image, and at times suggest a cosmic birth or a catastrophe, and the two pools rise and fall beneath the meniscus. Eventually the light picks up a figure lying in the darkness. She begins to speak and gives a brief account of her history in a description of the body's duel with the soul. So now what one begins to see in a light level that lifts very slowly is the figure of the vellum puppet lying on the surface with an actress lying underneath it, and she begins to speak. My story was written and then was printed, Anne Green, 3 times written down. Being one, yet 3 stories, 3 in 1. There was me who died. Myself was hanged and given over as dead. She was first. And there was also me, the resurrection, just like our Lord. That second was all eternity. Then also the babe, so small and still. Is it breathing? The little mouth as blue as water. Who can tell my guilt or my innocence? If you care to find evidence, watch my play. Behold God's providence. The doctor said those were my first 3 words. Behold God's providence, the good doctor said, I said. My voice is an occupying army. It has no body, and so it sets up camp inside me. But it is always trying to escape, forcing the way out through the teeth. And as she says these words, the lights come up to reveal that group of doctors, one of whom, Dr. Petty, looks uncannily like the young Rembrandt, whose painting of Dr. Tulp, as I've suggested, informs all such scenes. Dr. William Petty and Dr. Thomas Willis were the 2 Oxford anatomists attending the body who managed to save the woman, and I'll return to the historical account of the doctors shortly. They're clustered around a life-size puppet of a naked woman. The puppet was designed and made by Gowing, a South African sculptor whose work I had curated before. Young had in recent years been making vellum animals and objects that he molded that are simple but profound beings because of the luminous quality of the glow of the skin from which they are made. In an enigmatic way, their matter is their spirit. Of course, because the figure is vellum, she is both physical body and book. So I was thinking here too with the dialogue between Cervantes and Shakespeare, that there is something about vellum that is the substance of the book, as well as the substance of the body. Gowing had sourced medical prosthetic eyes for her, and so her gaze has a particular kind of focused intensity. So when you look at her, she looks as if she is looking at you, because that is the purpose of the prosthetic eye. It's meant to deceive us that there is consciousness being projected through it. As you'll see from the images, the actress, the primary puppeteer, and the puppet are at times bound to one another, as they might be in a bunraku-style Japanese puppetry performance. The bunraku puppets, some of you may have seen them, so you will actually be aware of the presence of the puppeteer who manipulates the puppet with a rod at the elbows. So there's a kind of a conglomerate of beings always implicit and present in the bunraku puppetry performance. And so that for me is very suggestive of a kind of a multiple and complex subjectivity. But these figures, the puppet, puppeteer, and actress, begin to prowl around the stage as if body and soul are searching for one another. What was extraordinary for me was to discover that at certain points the actress could be on one side of the stage and the puppet on the other side of the stage, and we absolutely presume that they are one sensibility. So it is extraordinary how much latitude the human viewer, the audience member, will afford to a scene in which we are being made to believe that the spirit is outside of the body. So that's, a very strong contemporary conversation about where mind is, So it's part of that order of thinking. The actress and puppet become identified. Oh, so this is the marvelous puppeteer Marty Kintu, who again is always visible as a presence manipulating Anne Green, and his very expressive performance somehow enters into Anne Green, and it is one of the conventions that I've learned through working with Handspring. The puppeteer does not make eye contact with the audience. The puppeteer's obligation is to draw your attention and regard to the puppet. So the puppeteer gazes into the puppet. They pour their subjectivity there, and so they create a vector so that every time you are watching the scene, you read the affect off the actor, but you transfer that affect into the puppet itself. So there's a moment at which they become clad in the same garment, and that really kind of intractably stitches themselves into one another. The volatility of the interchange between them is highly charged, and the question we repeatedly ask is the body the technology for the soul, or is the soul a technology for the body? As the play progresses, it is at times the puppet that consoles and comforts the actress, at times the actress who consoles the puppet. So this is just a rather nice image for you to see. I'm very interested always in trying to test the latitude of the audience's imagination, so I swung them around, because here you have the puppeteer with the puppet, and the puppet who looks as if she's manipulating the actress. So all of those kind of visual conceits are quite compelling and productive to think with. So here again, the puppet is consoling the actress. She's in a kind of a scene of interrogation and analysis. I was fortunate in having both a great young actress and a brilliant young puppeteer. So at any time during the scene, the audience is gripped by both performances. Gemma Khan was an ex-acting student of mine, was the actress, and Marty Kintu from Uganda is the puppeteer. So here is Anne Green being tortured by the church. The interrogation of Anne by the church turns on the question of the death of the child, and here's a fragment of the dialogue as the two wrestle with the resuscitated girl. Dr. Petty observes, her eyes are open. Is this a scene that knows it's watched? I have heard it said that one life is not sufficient, and we enact through our dreams those things that we do not perform in life. Assistant, some have written that our dreams are prophecies. Dr. Petty, yet another thinking on these matters has suggested that when we sleep, the outward senses, such as hearing, seeing and smell, retreat from their ordinary activities, and the inward powers, as memory and fantasy, are enhanced. Perhaps the soul does at such times inspect itself. The assistant, I did dream once that I was the devil, and the devil I was did dream of me. So then, as I suggested, the theological drama turns on whether Anne is guilty of infanticide or whether it was a spontaneous abortion. The doctor's assistant tries to extract the truth from her. And he says, a mother is advised to be not dark, not to conceal the birth of a babe. There's a taint of secrecy that is unlovely to the law's desire. For this we know, a child undisclosed is a child in danger. It is surely damned, having died without church. And he says to Anne, see the child? Look you, it stands outside the door, its hand too small to make a fist, and cannot even knock at heaven to ask for entry. See, it helpless pats the door. Pat, pat. The tormented girl is left alone, and we enter a curious dream state that is structured to complicate the sketch of Anne as either victim or vicious, because we don't entirely understand the status of what we watch or its claim as truth. So I'm going to show you a fragment of video, if I can pull this off. So it's a dream sequence in which we see Anne pondering over her complicity in the event. But because it has the status of a dream, none of us really know whether this is a scene of guilt because of consciousness, or whether she's actually been implicated in some diabolical act against the child. So now, wonderful. It's really just meant to be an unreadable scene. So I'm pleased to say, in those terms, if it fails, it works. At some stage, the puppet realizes that the poppet she holds will not quicken, and she flings it from her, and the mugs clatter onto the floor. The strange conceit of the puppet as mimic of the live is foregrounded here, and it's as if there's a tacit recognition that the offspring of the puppet cannot be anything but unnatural. So there are several other textures to the piece, and I'm just going to show you one or two of them. Penny Siopis, who is a visual artist who I've worked with before, made a really marvelous film for me in which we see a sort of a Walpurgisnacht of the torments of Anne Green when she is under threat of execution. In the whole question of complicity and agency in this seduction scene. So there is a moment in which the puppet herself begins to contemplate her implicatedness in the sexual scene that had precipitated the pregnancy. And she actually asks at one stage, maybe I did choose. My blush perhaps betrayed me as willing subject, willing object. Did he feel my desire, think to himself, I can have such a one? And in that scene, the puppet actually turns to the puppeteer and confronts him as her love object. So instead of that being a relationship of masking and erasure, she actually embraces her puppeteer as her lover. And at that point, the puppeteer asks a series of theoretical questions, commenting on the meanings of the play. And here's a small fragment. These are the miserable words, being got with child by a gentleman. There is no choice, it seems, for Anne, being got with child. Perhaps young girls never beget, they are begotten upon. The archive knows nothing about desire. It knows only this, that Anne says that she lost the child when it fell from her while busy with housework in her master's house. The archive seeks to hold what belongs to the law. Only literature keeps what belongs to lovers. When I first started working on the piece, it occurred to me that John Locke, who was himself a student of philosophy and anatomy in the decade after Anne Green's death, must surely have known about this event, must have had her in his mind when he wrote in his famous chapter on identity and person from the essay concerning human understanding that consciousness is what makes identity in persons. At the time of writing the play, I asserted as an act of faith that surely if over 20 fellows had written doggerel about Anne Green, then her case was surely challenging assumptions about personhood and identity for the scholars at Oxford. Here is one couplet from one of the fellows. Strange metamorphosis this dead live woman now differs from herself, and are such common. I've been doing research to strengthen my claim that Locke would have known about her, that she would have informed his thinking. I found a copy of a book that seems to resolve the matter for me. It's a translation of the lecture notes of the Oxford anatomy lecturer, Thomas Willis. These 17th century lecture notes are a fascinating rarity and show us the thinking and the theoretical practice of a man deemed now to be the origin of neuroscience in its earliest form. Thomas Willis was one of those two anatomists involved in the resurrection of Anne Green. Willis's lectures survive because of the notes kept by two students of anatomy at Oxford, Richard Lower, who went on to become the primary researcher in the heart, and Mr. John Locke. This is a striking find. These are evidence of an intellectual circuit of inquiry between an anatomist who resuscitated Anne Green and the foremost empirical philosopher of Europe. In my play, Anne Green herself had suggested that Locke would have been interested in her. and she quotes his comments on resurrections, and I'm quoting from the essay. And thus we may be able, without any difficulty, conceive the same person at the resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which he had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. One reason why this intrigues me is that it suggests that Locke's influential thinking about being and number in some way arises from the story of Anne Green. Philosophy and the natural sciences were co-emerging. It's provoked me to explore the relationship between Locke's medical practice and research and his philosophical investigation. That's the work I'm undertaking at present, and I intend to rework some of the sequences of the play in order to incorporate the new research. In other words, the performance and the theory are in an evolving relationship together. Christopher Wren's poem is not much more than a piece of youthful sardonicism, but it does serve to remind us that the young Wren was closely engaged in the community of scholarship around Doctors Petty and Willis, the two men who oversaw the resuscitation of Anne. Petty, who as a young man had studied anatomy at Leiden and was personal secretary to Hobbes, would go on after this encounter to become a significant theorist of money and also to oversee the land survey to facilitate the acts for the settlement of Ireland. And here is Petty. What I like about this is that it's kind of Hamlet, but he's not just looking at the skull. No, alas, for Yorick, he's actually pointing at the anatomical drawing of the skull at the same time. It's a curious coincidence, perhaps, that William Petty here is associated with a celebrated case of infanticide. Infanticide would again be identified with Petty, it seems, when he was invoked by Jonathan Swift and his notorious satire on the benefits of infanticide in his tract A Modest Proposal. There may perhaps have been just something that clung to Petty from one career to the next. While in Ireland, Petty was visited by the young Robert Boyle, who records how he and Petty together engaged in dissection of live animals, through which Boyle was able to study the circulation of blood, enabling a set of inquiries that must have been fundamental to his thinking about hydraulics. Boyle, however, was a deeply religious Christian, and he is one of the key spokespersons on the question of resurrection and identity. It's intriguing to imagine him thinking through some of these questions with Dr. Petty, one of Anne Green's resurrectionists. And then we turn to Willis. While Petty went off to engage in finance and political adventures, Wren meanwhile developed close relations with Willis, the man who would invent the term neurology. Wren is responsible for the fine illustrations of the brain for Willis's Cerebri Anatomy of 1664. So those are Wren's drawings of Willis's anatomizing of the brain. The bond between the two men is evidenced by a small coloured drawing held at the Wellcome Institute, showing a section of a small intestine. The image is signed in the bottom right corner by Wren and in the top left by Willis. The play itself became a meditation on the archive. As Anne's puppeteer asks, do we think we understand what such a story must mean? We are, after all, readers. And I found her through reading. I'm not a woman's archivist, but I do know that any woman who enters the archive finds there the archive of women. The accounts that document the saga of Anne Green are generally rather affirming and point to an ethos of humanism and compassion prevailing despite the impact of a civil war that had moved into the university campus. It's thus striking to discover, as a kind of literary repressed, a story in Robert Plot of an event not wholly different, but in some ways quite distinct. Several years later, in 1653, Elizabeth, no surname, was indicted for killing her bastard child and subsequently hanged at Greenwich, and who, on being cut down and carried to the George Inn in a coffin, was roused. However, quote, having no friends to appear for her, she was barbarously dragged the night following and hanged a second time till she was dead. One final note. The work was also a meditation on the relationship between the visual art tradition and the anatomy theatre. So Penny Siopis, who made the Walpurgis Nacht film for me, also undertook an astonishingly generous event. She was one of the performers in the piece, and her performance was to make illustrations. So she would come into the anatomy theatre every night with a box of coloured chalks, and she drew all around the back walls of the theatre scenes from the kind of massacre of infants in the whole kind of mythological archive of the abuse of women and children. And so these she drew on the walls during fragments of the performance. And so ultimately, at the end of the 2-week run, she washed them off the walls. Thanks very much, everyone.